Okay, folks, once again, if you are just joining us, I will just repeat that you are with us here on a JStream webinar on the risk of broader regional escalation in the Middle East. And we are going to get started. I will introduce myself. I'm Debra Shushan, the Director of Policy here at JStreet. And we are excited to bring you a really interesting webinar on this, of course, very important topic today with two expert speakers who I'll introduce in just a moment. Before I do that, let me just mention that, as always, on our JStream webinars, we always are pleased to entertain questions from the audience. So at any point during the webinar, if you would like to put a question for our speakers into the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should feel free to do that, and I will ask as many questions submitted by the audience as I can. In our recent webinars, we've gotten quite a number of questions from the audience, so if I don't ask your question, please forgive, but we will do our best to get to as many as possible. I will note that a recording of this discussion is going to be available on JStreet's YouTube channel later today, where you can rewatch, you can share with folks as well, and hopefully one of my colleagues will put the link there you go, thank you so much, for the YouTube channel in the chat. So please do keep an eye on that. The other thing that I just want to mention is that the JStreet Policy Center is going to be putting out shortly tomorrow an issue brief on this very topic of regional escalation. So for everyone who is already signed up to receive our publications, including issue briefs, that will be in your mailbox tomorrow. But let's say you are not already receiving those materials, you'll see in the chat the link to our policy center where you can put in your email address and be sure that you do get them in the future. So that'll be coming your way very soon. Now, on that, let's get started on our discussion for today, which is, of course, on regional escalation. Since the war between Israel and Hamas started with the Hamas attacks on Israel on October 7th, and the war that has been escalating between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, there have also been substantial escalations at various other hot spots in the region. And so we're going to really dig into all of those, talk about what's happening on the Israel-Lebanon border and the involvement of Hezbollah. We'll talk about the Red Sea and the involvement of the Houthis, what's happening in Iraq, Syria, and certainly we will talk about the involvement of Iran and what role they play in all of this. And in taking all of that apart and digging in with me, we have two great speakers today. We have with us Dr. Gil Murciano, who is the CEO of the Israel-based think tank Mitvim, and he is a leading researcher on Iranian interest, motivations, and allies within the region. He's also a member of the adjunct faculty of the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, where he serves as a lecturer on the international politics of the Middle East. Thank you so much for joining us, Gil, and welcome to you. We also have with us Mona Yacoubian, who is the Vice President of the Middle East and North Africa Center at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She joined the USIP after serving as a Deputy Assistant Administrator at the Middle East Bureau at USAID, which is the U.S. Agency for International Development, from 2014 to 17, where she had responsibility for Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. And together, they are going to help us as we dig into these various theaters and understand much better the current developments. So what I'd like to do as we get started, Gil and Mona, is I would love it if you could give us a bit of an overview of the situation as concerns the broader regional escalation. And if you could tell us what you think the likelihood is of a much wider regional conflict sparked by the ongoing Israel-Hamas war, where we're already seeing the most significant hotspots. And so what are the most important of these regional theaters in your view? Mona, could we start with you, and then Gil, over to you as well.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah, and thanks to J Street for having me. I think this is a really important discussion to be having, so I'm grateful to be taking part in it. So look, I think it's fair to say you could make the argument in the 100 days, a little bit plus, since the Hamas terrorist attack and ensuing conflict in Gaza, we have seen the conflict escalate in very dangerous ways. I would argue encompassing 4 different arenas in the Middle East. So arguably already we are in a region-wide war. Now, these arenas are not connected, and we have not seen the direct engagement of the United States and Iran, which would be, I think, what would be a flashpoint for a region-wide conflagration. But we're seeing very, very worrying trends in a number of hotspots that are really inflaming the region. And unfortunately, my sense is that the trend is toward greater escalation, not de-escalation, at least for the coming days and weeks.
Thank you for that, Mona. Gil, what about you?
I'll start with the good news, or the seemingly the good news. I think that the motivations of the major stakeholders, whether it is Israel, Iran, in some aspects also Hezbollah, still go against or negates the idea of regional conflict or the expansion of the scope of conflict for different reasons that we're probably going to examine later. The bad news is that for the veterans among us in Middle Eastern conflicts, the majority or most of the conflicts that we know of, the large-scale ones, started from unintended escalation. Not necessarily because of a decision that was destroyed in 2006, I remind you, during the Second Lebanon War, starting from Gaza, spilling over, the Shalit, the kidnapping of Shalit, and then spilling over into a large-scale war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And in many cases, what we see is the same dynamic that we know from the past. This self-generating, self-intensifying cycle of actions and reactions that leads to the same vector that Mona was just mentioning right now. Different points of escalation, different hubs, and this cycle of actions and reactions. We probably will speak about Aruri, but we also have to speak about, Mona mentioned that there's no direct confrontation between the US and Iran, but in Syria today, we also speak about the assassination of Iranian IRGC, Revolutionary Guard officials, including Mousavi, one of the senior officials, in an attack that is affiliated with Israel. So we are already talking about some taboos that were broken. Today, we've seen a missile attack, a coordinated missile attack from Iranian, launched from Iranian terrain against Iraq, against targets in Iraq and in Syria simultaneously. So we see new profile of operations. So even though we don't see clear motivations, again, we are in a phase where the actions creates their own dynamic.
No, that's absolutely right, and I appreciate you underscoring that. It's also really interesting that you brought up, Gil, the 2006 example. So it's obviously not unprecedented that we have had conflict between Israel and Hamas that has spilled over into the Lebanese theater with Hezbollah in a very significant way. And so I think that provides us with a very good opportunity to segue a bit into that theater. We're going to be examining a number of different theaters, but I do think it's helpful to move to Israel's northern border and the conflict that we are seeing unfolding with Hezbollah. And I wonder if the two of you could give us your perspective on Hezbollah, what its key interests are, the extent to which it is interested in escalating or avoiding escalation. And to that point, what you see as Israel's set of interests in this conflict vis-a-vis Hezbollah as well. Does Israel, the Israeli leadership, feel that it has an interest in de-escalating? Or is there a judgment that in order for Israelis who have moved from the Lebanese border, who have had to move from their homes, in order for them to be able to return, that there has to be a broader reckoning with Hezbollah? So, Gil, maybe we could start with you first on this one.
Sure. First of all, I think that we are already speaking about a reality, I wouldn't say of limited warfare, not full scale, but still a reality of warfare between Israel and Hezbollah directly, that is keep on expanding basically and offering new operational phenomenon and so on, but still one that is obviously limited. And it always connects to the question of whether we can see Hezbollah, the never-ending discussion among us experts, whether we should see Hezbollah as a proxy of Iran, guided, led, and so on, or more of a national organization controlled or guided by Lebanese, maybe not Lebanese, but Shiite population in Lebanon considerations. Since the Hezbollah intervention in the Syrian civil war, which was in many ways against the so-called Lebanese interest, I tend to see them as 60-40. 60% guided by Iran, 40%. We are tapping into a discussion, really never-ending discussion. However, the 40 matters and can punch above its weight. The 60-40 is not relevant in any decision-making junction. And when we are currently in a situation where we speak about Lebanon in its current situation, as a country that is on the verge or beyond collapse economically and socially, where Hezbollah is facing much criticism and opposition from within before the war, and with the current situation right now of the loss of the element of surprise in any way in an attack on Israel, where the entire Israeli hundreds of thousands of reservists are on the border, the entire society is in a war state, and so on. And by the way, 1.5 air carrier groups are parked in the Mediterranean. It's not exactly the most favorable conditions for Hezbollah to expand the scope of conflict. However, we have to understand the major dilemma here. And this is, by the way, a dilemma that does not just relate to Hezbollah, but also to Iran and to this unification of arenas, this seemingly combined camp of allies, proxies of Iran that Mona mentioned beforehand. And here we see a real test point for not just the resolve, but the coordination or the ability of this camp to work together. And the main dilemma is, if you expand, if you try and challenge Israel in order to reduce the pressure from Gaza, then you risk engaging in a large-scale conflict with Israel and maybe the US in unfavorable terms. But if you don't, then you might lose the trust of some of the proxies. You might lose face in the Arab world. In the crunch time, you didn't show up in order to help the Palestinians to reduce the military pressure. And that's why we see, if you analyze the speeches, meticulously planned the speeches by the leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, you see one major motive. We are already fulfilling our promise. In subtext, don't expect us to do much more in the current situation. Okay, so what we are doing right now is already fulfilling the promise. Okay, so that's one thing about Hezbollah. Israeli motivations that you mentioned. I would say that the major incentives at the moment for the expansion of scope of warfare is this feeling that this is the opportunity. One of the major I would say, paradigms that collapsed on the 7th of October in Israel is the paradigm of conflict management, what was called in Israel the war between the worlds, this illusion that there's no way to solve Israel's strategic problem with Hezbollah in the north and Hamas in the south. So what you need to do, you need to accept the fact that every couple of years there's going to be some kind of an escalation, and you're just trying to, to spread the time or to expand the time between one escalation and another, and you live with Hezbollah from the other side, you live with Hamas from the other side of the border. That paradigm has actually collapsed. And one of the conclusions that was, one of the lessons that were learned by some of the Israeli strategic thinkers is that you need to find decisive solutions to the problems. And therefore, what I described right now is unfavorable conditions for Hezbollah, sometimes seen by Israel as this is the opportunity that won't repeat itself. I remind you that according to foreign sources, and again, I am not in a position to really analyze, maybe Mona has more details about that, but when the first US intervention, involvement in Israeli decision-making early on, I would even say 8th or 9th of October, according to those sources, was meant to stop an Israeli preemptive strike against Hezbollah, as part of some kind of a plan. If Hamas opens fire, Hezbollah reacts, and then, So this is one idea. And the second one, you mentioned it, and I think it's super crucial. The ability of Israeli citizens, more than 100,000 Israeli citizens, to go back to the area of the border, to live in, go back to their towns and their villages is not just a general source of pressure. It is seen in Israel as one of the main test point to define or to describe the outcome of this entire, engagement, not just the Gaza war, but altogether the entire discussion. So whether you can achieve it in political means or through military actions is something that, remains to be seen. But the goal itself is at the core of the Israeli discourse, by the way, from left to right. I mean, if you can, from center to right, the left in Israel is a claim more than, unfortunately, more than, but that's basically the Israeli disincentive altogether. So again, there's, you can see that there's strong incentive. One last word about the Israelis. One of the major disincentives is the understanding that when you go to war against Hezbollah, which is now, I would say, the estimation, is basically seen or perceived as one of the strongest armies in the region, with a stockpile of missiles, with the high precision and a project, the upgrading of some of those rockets to inflict strategic damage in Israel, with their Radwan special forces and so on. You need to come prepared. Not just the IDF necessarily, but the society itself, the Israeli society. And it won't be, I won't be lying if I say that we do have a precedent in this situation of a war that is waged with a very high motivation by the public, but with zero trust in the government. Not exactly the optimal conditions to engage in a major war with Hezbollah.
Thanks so much, Gilo. That's really really helpful on multiple fronts, and I'd love to get your thoughts too, Mona, on this, including the question. Gil said in terms of factors guiding Hezbollah, 60-40. In terms of Iran versus internal Lebanese motivations. Would love to get your thoughts on that as well.
Sure, thank you, and I agree with pretty much everything Gil said. I think you'll see some nuanced differences between us. First, let's start with Hezbollah and its motivations. And I think I'd be very clear. Is it 60-40? Is it 50-50? Is it 40-60? In a way, it doesn't matter. I view Hezbollah very much as a hybrid actor. Yes, indeed, it is deeply connected to Iran and is considered the crown jewel of Iran's various proxies in the region. But it is also distinctly Lebanese. It has members of parliament. It has connections to, well, it's the parliament so much as it functions, the government so much as it functions. The point being that Hezbollah takes both Lebanese prerogatives into its decision-making as well as Iranian. And so in this case, I believe that Hezbollah is not interested in a wider war with Israel. I think it felt compelled to respond, of course, after Hamas engaged and the ensuing conflict. But it is interesting, Gil notes Nasrallah's speeches. And the first speech was a very clear attempt to delineate what are Hamas's interests and Hamas's moves, and this is a distinctly Palestinian endeavor, and what their role is. And that was purposeful. Because as Gil also rightly notes, Lebanon is in no shape and in no interest in engaging in a major war with Israel. This is a country that is already on its knees, a country that is suffering poverty rates of 80%, triple-digit inflation, a country that has gone through, frankly, unbelievable economic and social collapse. And so there's absolutely no appetite for war, and Hezbollah knows that and understands that. I'd also note, just as an interesting aside, let's not forget, it was in September of 2022 when, through the U.S. negotiator Amos Hochstein, Israel and Lebanon negotiated it's a permanent maritime border. That was done with the implicit acquiescence of Hezbollah. Why? Because they absolutely took on board the sort of factors of Lebanese public desires and the desire not to continue war, and in fact, the desire to try and exploit the perceived natural gas reserves in the Mediterranean that maritime border agreement ensured that they could try to pursue. So the point being, I think Hezbollah is a rational actor. I think their calculus on these issues is multifaceted. Yes, indeed, they do have to put out some face of the resistance, hence you see these harassing attacks. But at the same time, they're not going to drag Lebanon into a war with Israel, as I think they understand that the downsides of that are significant. I would also agree that how I would characterize the current state of conflict is one of low-level conflict between Lebanon and Israel that's largely been confined to the border areas. The most significant impact has been displacement. The figures I see are 80,000 Israelis displaced from the north of Israel, 75,000 Lebanese displaced from the south of Lebanon. So that's the most significant impact. But as Gil rightly noted in his initial response, and I couldn't agree more, we have a very significant chance of unintended escalation, miscalculation that very quickly leads to a broader conflict. We didn't talk about the assassination in Beirut of the Hamas official Salah Harouri, which has been attributed to Israel. That was a pretty significant escalatory move in terms of now bringing Beirut into this particular conflict now for the first time and raising fears of an escalation. It's notable, another data point about Hezbollah's interest in not expanding the conflict. It's notable that Hezbollah did respond, but I would argue responded relatively symbolically in terms of what it could have done. And I think that demonstrates that they are looking to limit their response. They are not interested in getting involved in a wider war. The only other comment I would add to this, I'm not an expert on Israel or how the Israeli government operates, but I very much would associate myself with Gil's analysis. It does seem that there's a division within the Israeli national security apparatus as to whether or not to seize this moment as an opportunity because of Hezbollah's growing capabilities, its arsenal of some 150,000 missiles, et cetera. Is this the time to go after those? But I think it's also understood that any war between Israel and Lebanon today will far eclipse what was witnessed in 2006. It will be devastating, I think, for both sides. Hence, and this is where I'll conclude, the intervention of the United States. I think the United States is the indispensable actor in terms of its ability to negotiate quietly behind the scenes a de-escalation of tensions on the border, and maybe even, I'm a little skeptical in the short term, but maybe even a demarcation of the land border between Israel and Lebanon. I think the issue that we have here in front of us, though, is a ticking clock between efforts at diplomacy and efforts at de-escalation, as opposed to the imperatives, I think certainly on the Israeli side, to get Hezbollah pushed back from that border so that Israelis can return to their home. And I think pressures on Hezbollah as we see escalations across the region, and as we see perhaps that they may feel compelled to engage in a more serious way. Last point. Iran is also not interested in expending, if you will, sorry to use that term so crudely, but expending Hezbollah in terms of the current conflict. I would argue Iran is also not interested in Hezbollah engaging in all-out war with Israel at this time, because Hezbollah serves as a very important deterrent force from Iran's perspective that keeps things on balance between Israel and Iran. So that was a little complicated answer. I'll stop there.
Extremely helpful, Mona. Thank you so much for that. And you know, folks probably saw Gil and I both nodding in terms of your last comment about the importance for Iran of preserving Hezbollah as that deterrent, presumably particularly against an attack on Iran itself and its nuclear capabilities. And often Hezbollah has been seen as, you know, the ultimate insurance policy as far as that's concerned. So that does make a lot of sense. I do want to move on quickly to other theaters, but because this one is so important, I have one last kind of question for each of you, which I'll give you each an opportunity to answer it, and then we'll move on. Mona, for you, the question is, you mentioned the assassination of Saleh Arouri in Beirut, a senior Hamas official. Subsequently, just in this past week, we've seen additional assassinations, targeted assassinations by Israel aimed at senior Hezbollah commanders as well. And so my question for you is, you mentioned that the response, at least the initial response from Hezbollah, was measured and it was rather symbolic. Do you see a more significant response coming? And is that something that Amos Hochstein's diplomacy might be able to, you know, to tamp down in some way? And Gil, I think there's interest for me and also from folks in our audience for you to talk a little bit further about Israel's thinking on this. And not just Israel's thinking, but whether you see a military solution here for Israel vis-a-vis Hezbollah. And what can you tell us about Israel's capability to fight major wars with Hamas and Hezbollah at the same time? I've certainly seen US military assessments that are not optimistic on Israel's capacity to do that. So maybe Mona, will turn to you, and then Gil on those two sets of questions.
So I'll try to be brief. I think Hezbollah will continue to calibrate its response, even with the kinds of targeted killings we're seeing of senior Hezbollah commanders, as you rightly note. Most recently in southern Lebanon, there have also been a large number of Hezbollah commanders in Syria who have been targeted by a stepped-up campaign by Israel in that arena. It appears to me that because of what I've said to you from the outset, that Hezbollah is not interested in an all-out war with Israel, that they are willing to absorb these losses. However, this gets to the unintended escalation or kind of escalation that takes on a life of its own. Should Israel continue to target these senior leaders? Should Israel again choose to attack targets in Beirut? All of these kinds of escalatory measures will put further pressure on Hezbollah to respond in a more forceful way. Hence the ticking clock I noted to you, with diplomacy and efforts to try and de-escalate before the dynamics spiral out of control.
Thank you. Gil.
Yeah, I'm also going to be brief. I mean, first of all, regarding Arouri, just one word about the Israeli operational thinking. I mean, we mentioned the dilemma beforehand and the criticism in Hezbollah of sacrificing or potentially sacrificing Lebanon for the Gaza war and so on. And I think one of the goals was to emphasize the gap. By taking out Arouri, you present Hezbollah with a dilemma. If you retaliate according to the rules of the game, that's fine. But if you endanger a destruction, an overarching destruction of Lebanon because of a Palestinian, not one of your own, not a Hezbollah leader, by a Palestinian Hamas leader, then obviously there's a dilemma here, and I think it was one of the operational thinking behind it. Can Israel fight in two different fronts, with the Hezbollah and with the Hamas in the same time? I think that the Israeli scenario or the planning or the strategic planning of the IDF was always meant to do exactly that, to try and engage with both arenas. We know that currently the capacity of at least the Israeli Air Force in this limited, rather limited. I mean, it's obviously causes major destruction and human casualties, but still a pretty limited type of warfare when it comes to the Air Force or to strategic capabilities. So the idea is that especially now when Israel is moving to the next phase of more targeted operation in Gaza, and some of the reservists are either being discharged or temporarily discharged or are being sent to the north, then Israel could somewhat shift gears in many ways and let's say redeploy its resources to the north. But the question is not just about the IDF. And as Mona mentioned, a war with Hezbollah would cause a major, I would say a major damage to the home front in Israel, basically. Not just in civilian casualties, but also in strategic assets. We spoke about the gas installations in the Mediterranean, the Israeli ones. We spoke about different strategic targets in Israel. We spoke about the fact that the IDF spent most of the last couple of years trying to prevent Hezbollah from acquiring capabilities for, precise or guided the GPS guided capabilities to hit those targets with limited success. So there's a clear idea here that such a conflict would require coordination with allies, specifically the US, not just operational in using the air defense capabilities, maybe of the US fleet, basically, but also political coordinations. And again, it is an operation that takes some, it takes some preparing and some specific time to build. But the major question is about the society itself, its resolve, its resilience in such a situation. The estimations speak about 1,500 missiles a day for at least a week. Attacks by 1,500 missiles. That's a completely different story than Hamas. And we are talking about a society that right now, when we examine the capacities of government units, basically, in Israel, then until now, it is pretty, I wouldn't say dysfunctional, but the level of public trust in those systems are limited. So the idea of fighting in two fronts in the same time is right now is seen as a less desirable idea. As mentioned, events could lead to that. Another option we can think about, by the way, we tend to look at the worst case scenario in the Israel-Lebanon war, Israel-Hezbollah war, as a binary option, which will all know nothing, a full-scale attack of what we have now. But there's also certain, there's a ladder of escalation, escalatory moves that we need to assume. The ability of those sides to contain and to prevent us from spilling over from one layer to the other is obviously becoming more and more limited.
Gil, just one more. We had a question from the audience that I do want to pose to you before we move on from Lebanon and Hezbollah. And the question is about tunnels and what kind of tunnels exist between South Lebanon and Israel, and to what extent Hezbollah could exploit that to inflict pain upon Israel.
Well, I think the major threat right now, especially if you speak about, with the citizens in the north of Israel, is not the missiles. This has always been part of their reality in many ways, especially before 2006. And it's not the military activity or the advanced anti-tank missiles that Hezbollah has in arsenal, but the Radwan force, the special forces, basically duplication of what we've seen in the border with Gaza. You always deal with with the previous trauma. And that obviously what the trauma of the 7th of October shapes the Israeli concerns and strategic thinking in the north. And especially, the conditions upon which civilians are actually going to come back. So you know that in the last couple of years, we can differentiate between what we call offensive tunnels and defensive, or let's say domestic tunnels. When we speak about offensive tunnels, those are tunnels that are built in order to infiltrate into Israel. Two major ones were basically exposed. Was also exposed to the public. Major operations, really incredible construction operations over years, basically, which can be compared with what we see in Gaza. So that's one of the major threats. It is a threat that is being handled as in the threat scenarios of the Northern Command in Israel. Whether or not Israel was able to identify and to locate all the different offensive tunnels is still in a question. But the same challenges and lessons being learned from the warfare in Gaza will be, if such an operation would occur, will be implemented in Hezbollah. Tunneling is one of the major operational processes of this entire war, both in Gaza and in South Lebanon, basically.
Thank you so much for that, Gil. So I do want to move on to the second theater that I want to make sure that we dig into, which has really heated up considerably just in the last week or so. And that is what is happening in the Red Sea, and specifically involves a Yemeni group, the Houthis, who have emerged as a major actor in this crisis and in this regional escalation. So I do want to dig into that a little bit and maybe start by just, with the basics here for our folks on the call and get a sense of who the Houthis are and what their motivations are and why they've become a serious actor in all of this. And so Mona, I wonder if you might get us started on that.
Sure. The Houthis are a Shia offshoot rebel group based in Yemen who have seen their fortunes rise as a result of the conflict in Yemen, eventually taking over Sana'a, the capital, in 2014, which then prompted Saudi Arabia and the UAE to engage in a war with the Houthis. The thought being it'll be 4 or 5 weeks, we'll, vanquish these pesky rebels and bring some more stability and favorable government back into Yemen. Here we are, however many years later, 6, 7 years later, and you see how that conflict has evolved. And if anything, the Houthis have become more powerful, more strong. They are indeed a proxy of Iran, although I would argue they are the kind of the neophytes or the newest of the various proxy groups. And their ties to Iran are therefore a bit more tenuous. But you can see that the Iranians also see and have put quite a bit into this group in terms of providing weapons, intelligence, now for these Red Sea attacks. They also have sort of sat at the feet or the elbow of other proxies, namely Hezbollah, that have also provided training. And as a result, you're seeing them develop their own homegrown capabilities, all of which suggests that this is actually becoming, I don't want to exaggerate their power, but they're becoming a more consequential proxy group that's having a real impact, as we are seeing with these attacks in the Red Sea. The Houthis, in my view, have exploited the conflict in Gaza. They saw an opportunity to grab the international spotlight, and that's exactly what they've done with these attacks that are frankly on all kinds of shipping, commercial shipping targets, more than 24. Now we have seen an escalation to US military targets. We've also seen an escalation in their tactics, including an attack last week that included some 18 drones, ballistic missiles, and other kinds of weaponry. And that's the attack that prompted the United States to say, okay, enough. And the US, together with the UK, undertook strikes now in Yemen against Houthi targets. And what's notable is we are now seeing yet another phase in this conflict, one that has brought the US now directly into conflict with, in this case, the Houthis in Yemen. So the US's military involvement is now deepening as a result. Unfortunately, the hope that these attacks would deter the Houthis from undertaking further attacks have not borne out. We are seeing continued attacks on shipping targets in the Red Sea, all of which is having an enormous global impact on shipping. right? So some 16% of the world's commerce passes through the Red Sea. And as a result, because of the instability, major shipping companies are choosing not to go through the Red Sea and to go a much longer route around the Horn of Africa. This is resulting, therefore, in delays in shipping, not insignificant, increased costs of shipping. And now we're seeing knock-on effects in the European manufacturing industry, where Tesla, for example, has had to temporarily pause its production in Europe because of supply chain delays as a result of this. So this is an extraordinarily, I would say, consequential and dangerous escalatory dynamic that we are seeing in the Red Sea that has pulled the U.S. directly in. And again, last thing I'll say, the Houthis, the U.S. and U.K. strikes on Yemen, not only are they not deterring the Houthis may well be welcoming these strikes. They really have nothing to lose. This isn't Hezbollah, that's making these very rational, thoughtful calculations about what they should and shouldn't do. I think from the Houthi perspective, there's very little downside to the situation they find themselves in. As I said, it has taken this once unknown group and thrust it onto the international stage, and it is also galvanizing support domestically as a result. So I think for the Houthis, unfortunately, it's all upside. And all they have to do is keep showing that they're still there. And before you know it, you end up into, a slippery slope toward deepening conflict that drags the U.S. further in, I think, in very dangerous ways.
Well, thank you for that. That's obviously very disturbing, but nonetheless very important analysis, Mona, and I greatly appreciate it. And Gil, I wonder if you might offer your thoughts on this and your thoughts, for example, on the Houthis' relationship with Iran. And, if we think that Iran at this point, its strategic calculation, its motivations are not to pursue a full-fledged wider war, would the Iranians have the incentive to try to pull the Houthis back? I mean, if the Houthis feel they have nothing to lose and they're not deterrable, is Iran deterrable? Would Iran have the ability to rein in the Houthis in this scenario?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I completely agree with Mona's analysis that the description of the Houthis as the loose cannon, or let's say the fringe side of this alliance, this a coalition of Iranian allies and proxies. Absolutely, it is completely my analysis that they are mostly motivated by either domestic motivation, strengthening their own force through connecting to the Palestinian cause internally and domestically, and squashing any type of protest against them. Also, a power projection to the Saudis. We're on the verge of the Saudis signing an armistice agreement, or a ceasefire agreement, basically, with the Houthis after a very bloody war. The Saudis and the Emiratis were actually involved in it. So also, by the way, using certain weapon system in many ways, I think, are projecting the power and the ability to go back to warfare and to expect certain prices from the Saudis in the future war. So we see a couple of things. And then there's the Iranians. And the Iranian capability to limit or to control Houthi responses is obviously limited. They supply, as mentioned, intelligence about the targets. They supply guidance, of course, political support. But again, we are talking about an actor, a stakeholder that has its own motivations here. Right now, the Houthi activity serves the Iranian purpose. I would even say it solves a problem for them. If we spoke about the dilemma, then in the aftermath of the Arouri assassination, especially, by the way, the aftermath of the Mousavi assassination, the Iranian IRGC official, though the Arouri assassination happened exactly 4 years after the Soleimani assassination. Soleimani, basically the architect of this entire alliance. And if I'm even connecting to that the events, the terrorist attack by Daesh near Tehran, in Karman, during the service in commemoration of Soleimani, then you create an entire mindset or an atmosphere which the hardliners in Iran are utilizing in order to call for stronger or different type of retaliation. And the Houthis and their active participation, their operations against ships sailing to Israel on the side of the Palestinians allows the Iranians to claim, yes, we are doing something here. We did change the level of retaliation. So up until now, it serves the Iranian purpose. When does it actually becomes a completely different story in this balancing act by the Iranians? When the topic becomes more and more international. Because up until now, we've seen that the separation between the Western camp and the competitors of the West, especially Russia, but also China, is pretty clear here. I mean, the Western side, let's say, is on the Israeli side in general terms, and you see the Chinese and you see the Russians, of course, are providing political support at least to the other side. But this trade route is also connected deeply with Chinese. I mean, Russian is a different case here, but Chinese interests. So if this becomes a burden for these countries, we might see the Iranians singing a different tune. I'm just going to mention one thing. In the UN Security Council condemnation of the Houthi activity, the Chinese and Russians abstained, did not oppose it. And if you look at it as an indication that's, with the nuances of this very subtle game of diplomacy, that might indicate this is one bridge too far. And that might be an incentive. The question is, even if the Iranians want to limit this loose cannon, can they? Do they have the capacity, the capability to do so? So this is at least one arena where we already seen an indication to a regional conflict or even international conflict. And I will say just one more thing about it. If there was any thoughts in American strategic thinking, if you can describe it as some kind of one cohesive process about the role of the Middle East, or about the declining role of the Middle East in the overarching international games, and I think this issue of maritime security, international trade routes, we see how the shockwaves of Gaza are not just felt in Beirut or in Baghdad or Tehran, but also in, I don't know where Tesla is sitting in Europe, I don't know, Rotterdam or Berlin or whoever, and that's interesting.
Absolutely. We know that the folks within the Biden administration and the National Security Council and the State Department who are working these issues saw it as their goal to keep the Middle East off of the president's plate, and very, very clearly that unfortunately has not worked. And as you point out, the maritime situation here is obviously a very key part of that. I want to explicitly turn, you touched on it, Gil, but I want to turn to the theaters in Iraq and Syria and what role those play in all of this, and what risks are at stake for the U.S., particularly with U.S. troops stationed in Iraq, and the uptick in attack and response by Iranian-linked groups, actions by the United States. How should we evaluate all of that, the risks there, in the context of this broader picture? So Mona, I'll turn to you for that, if I could.
Yeah, I think this is a really important arena, Deborah, to be focused on. I mean, since October 7th, or actually more since October 17th, I think is the date with the hospital, all the back and forth about what happened with that hospital, which was eventually determined to be hit by an errant Palestinian missile. But nonetheless, that was sort of a watershed moment in terms of the responses that we saw in the region. Since that time, and depending on the count, U.S. targets in both Iraq and Syria have been hit more than 130 times by these various Iranian-backed groups operating in the area. We've also seen a distinct uptick in the tempo of attacks starting in December, and we also saw the U.S. Embassy targeted by mortars in December. So another sort of escalation, if you will, of bringing in a civilian target. This is not the first time it's happened, but I'm saying in the context of the current conflict. The U.S. Again kept trying to deter, and I think this is a theme that we should be thinking about throughout this discussion. What constitutes effective deterrence? And the U.S. Multiple times have hit various of these groups, first hitting their sites, then hitting some of their personnel, and then deciding on January 4th to target and kill the leader of one of the more extreme Iranian-backed groups, a group called Harakat Nujaba. That drone strike took place in Baghdad, which is also rare. And that then prompted the government in Baghdad to start to make noises about expelling U.S. forces from Iraq, which would be significant on many levels, both in terms of the U.S. continuing campaign against ISIS, and it would be a distinct win for Iran, who has long sought to get the United States ejected from Iraq. Now, there have been quiet reassurances made to us by senior members of the Iraqi government that they indeed would like the United States to maintain its presence. But I think the point is this has increased pressure on the Iraqi government to expel the U.S. from Iraq. So all of this, I think, is having an enormous impact over the long term in terms of U.S. national security interests in the region. And again, how we balance between deterring attacks, calibrating that with tipping into larger conflict, or ending up prompting all kinds of knock-on effects that are not favorable to U.S. interests. The last thing I'd like to add, because I think it's important, we've touched on Iran in different ways. You've noted, I think Gil talked about the ISIS attacks in Kerman. That is yet another kind of bit of static that gets injected into an already very complex situation, where when those attacks first took place, the suicide attacks at the anniversary of Soleimani's death at his gravesite, there was initial confusion that it was Israel that had undertaken the attacks, not ISIS. Now, ISIS then claimed the attack, and now Iran has felt compelled to respond to that attack by today or yesterday firing ballistic missiles at sites in northern Iraq, in and around Erbil, and also in Syria, in retaliation for the ISIS strikes. The Iranians also, though, claim to have hit an Israeli Mossad's site in Erbil as part of that those strikes, and the Israelis, at least as of now, have not responded to that claim. What I'm raising here is you are seeing an increasingly complex and dangerous situation in which multiple conflicts and multiple stakeholders are playing out their various fights and vendettas in ways that can be very dangerous. Because it's very easy for there to be miscalculation, miscommunication, and error in such a pitched environment. And so this is, I think, what we're watching most closely when it comes to at least Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. Syria is another question which I'm happy to talk about, but I don't want to take too much time.
Thanks so much for that, Mona. Gil, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about Syria, because I know that's part of your expertise, and Mona, I think, covered Iraq really well. And one other thing that I'd love for either of you to comment on, and we are, I should note, coming to the end of our hour, so we are going to need to wrap up. So maybe Gil, why don't you talk about Syria? And then Mona, I'm going to ask for you to have the last word on whether there's any other, in addition to all of the theaters we've talked about so far, and there's more than enough, anything else we should have on our radar screens. We did get a question from the audience about whether there could even potentially be some sort of threat for Israel from Egypt. So if you could address that and any other threats that we should have on our radar screen. So Gil, I'll ask you to talk about Syria first.
I actually start with Egypt just to cover that specific base really quickly. I mean, the major threat here is not, of course, militarily. I hope so. We need to never say never, right? But I mean, in this case, we're talking mainly about a diplomatic issue that relates to the Philadelphia, as it's called, route, the area separating the Gaza Strip from Egypt, which is also the area where most of the tunnels been dug. You know, this is the area where smuggling is done of weapons and everything else basically into Gaza. And there's a discussion, the Israelis understand today, one of the greatest mistakes of the disengagement was not to control this specific area, and therefore there's a demand to completely change the situation, to keep it in Israeli hands. that goes against, in some ways, the Israeli-Egyptian peace accords or the military amendment to these specific accords. It's a long discussion. It's mostly a diplomatic discussion right now. But it is also fueled by all kinds of, I mean, it will be an understatement to define irresponsible statements by Israeli members of government talking about sending millions of Gazans from the Gaza Strip into Egypt, settling them there. So in a nutshell, that's the issue regarding Egypt. Syria, as Mona mentioned, there's a complete change in Israeli level of military operations, aerial operations in Syria. The Damascus International Airport is out of commission for most of the world up until now. There was an attack in Aleppo today. The idea mainly is to prevent Iran from rearming Hezbollah. Very complicated effort, almost put, it's a little bit like putting your finger into a dam, basically, with a lot of different efforts by the Iranians to break this specific obstacle. And the same thing regarding attacks on Al-Quds forces, on the Revolutionary Guards in Syria. Now, until now, we also discussed the conflicting interest of the Assad regime. Before we started this war, there were discussions about, I wouldn't call normalizing relations with Syria, but somewhat the possibility of the Saudis, the Emiratis and others, the Qatarians basically maybe are already there, involving themselves in the reconstruction, rehabilitation of Syria, more as a slogan than real plan, but still some willingness. And this war in many ways negates this effort for the Assad regime. Nevertheless, still the Iranian influence right now on the Syrian ecosystem is very deep. On the army, on the rebuilding on the army, of militias in the south, on a number of different directions. One of the major scenarios that I think that Israel should take into account is that the escalation that we speak about, if Iran decide to escalate, would not happen from the Lebanese border, from the most obvious location, because of the prices we just mentioned, to Hezbollah, one of the crown jewels of Iran, to the fact that the legitimacy of such an attack is questioned. Syria is a different thing. An attack on the Golan, an occupied territory, it's a different type of legitimacy, connecting, maybe creating some kind of international connection or so on. It is also a place where the rules of the games are much more loose, especially from the Israeli side. So even the possibility of retaliation would offer, and it's a place where Israel, this is a third front, basically, for the Israelis. So then you have Lebanon, you have Gaza. We didn't speak about the West Bank, maybe in the next briefing, but Syria can also serve as this purpose. This is really a nutshell of a nutshell, but in the limits of time, I'll stop here.
Great. Mona, I'm going to give you the last word here.
Well, not much to add, I think, to what Gil has said. I think he very rightly, I very much agree with his analysis, particularly on Syria, which I would remind viewers has long been the arena where a shadow war between Israel and Iran has played out. It's long been considered the safer of the arenas in which to play these various battles out in. I think what I would want to conclude by is just underscoring, if the takeaway isn't clear, that the trajectory of this conflict in Gaza and its reverberations now well into the rest of the region will shape the region for generations to come. And I think we are today poised very much at the fork of two paths. One, I'm afraid we're well along on, which is a path of escalation and conflict and deepening tensions that could reverberate again for a generation. The other path that I think we need to hold out for is one in which diplomacy and deterrence are well calibrated and move this region from one of deepening conflict to one of transformational peace. It may not seem apparent today, but it is very clearly there as an option if bold and creative policymakers choose to take it.
That's extremely helpful framing, Mona, and a great place, I think, for us really to wrap up. And, just to note on that, obviously, that there is a really important role for the United States to play in terms of which of those forks, obviously, that we take. And we at J Street, of course, have been very supportive and continue to be very supportive of efforts taken by the Biden administration to de-escalate this situation through use of skillful diplomacy. And we think that's extremely important. So I do just want to remind folks that you will be able to watch this webinar and share it with any folks that you would like to, and the great insights of our two guests at our YouTube channel. And also want to remind that the Policy Center's issue brief is coming, and I will note vis-a-vis Gil's point that it does also include a section on the West Bank. We here at J Street are always very, very focused on what's happening in the West Bank. And so we would certainly not leave that out, even though we didn't focus on it here today. And with that, I want to just extend my heartfelt thanks to Mona, to Gil for spending this time with us and for your considerable expertise. Thank you both so much. And with that, folks, that ends today's webinar. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us.